Díomh agus fáilte gach den an seo nucht. De Mart ó Stol our Udoma Ethnic Minority Subcommittee on Diaspora Dartello. This House believes the Afro-Caribbean sock isn't for everyone, and that motion was put down. On Seachtain Seo Huggin, next week we are hosting a debate that this House would go nuclear, featuring Professor in Physics and Science Education, Dr. Eric Brew. On the Thursday after next, on the 20th of November at 5 o'clock before the debate, Began Philip Dana on five-a-side football league can argue Crinny La High for November. The sign-up form for that will be up in the next few days. You can join for €4 or you can just come to watch. We want as diverse a group as possible to join us, so there will be free fake mustaches for any women and blonde men participating. November is always very tough for us. And note, we have a very special debate in collaboration with the Student Economic Review joining us today. Canadian Sports show the House has proposed that it would give communism another shot. In line with our new ideology, the debate winners will not be decided by a vote, but by our benevolent judges on high on the balcony tonight. Oligarchy is not always fun, but it's a necessary sacrifice to make sometimes. The classless society is coming any day now, and you can experience a glimpse of it at our afters in Tap tonight. The deadline for maiden sign-ups is approaching. There will be 3 rounds tomorrow, so it's not at all too late to get involved. But we are absolutely delighted to have experts in politics and economics joining us for our debate tonight. As chairperson of the debate, we have the head of the Polish diplomatic mission to Ireland and previous Polish ambassador to Moldova and to Belarus. As an acclaimed journalist since the 1980s, he wrote about the democratization process in countries of the Eastern Bloc. And continues to do so. Masha the Hulle, Hug Fulcher Road, August Bulabus, or Mr. Artur Michalski. Judging from the balcony, it is an absolute privilege to have a fantastic array of judges. We have Dr. Adele Whelan, Senior Research Officer in the Economic Analysis Division at the Economic and Social Research Institute. In Accolade, we have Dr. Kate Hines, Assistant Professor of Economics at Dublin City University. August Mar-Multor Ger, we have Dr. Matthias Dilling, Assistant Professor of Political Science and Qualitative Methods from our very own Trinity College Dublin. Please, Hogbulabus Olvor for our judges here tonight. Lishin Tulanoti on Cumming Creagna, and we can let the debate begin.
Are there no objections to me signing these minutes as a true and accurate record of the last private business meeting? There being none, I shall duly sign. Madam Treasurer, are there any fines?
There are no fines.
Mr. Secretary, are there any reports to be read?
There are no reports to be read.
The time for questions is now open.
Mr. Secretary, are there any motions on notice?
There are no motions on notice.
Mr. Secretary, are there any motions on not on notice?
There are no motions not on notice.
The time for questions is now closed.
This brings us onto general business of the society. Are there any motions to be raised in general businesses? There being no further business, this private business meeting is adjourned. Our secretary should retire and return with our guests for tonight's debate. I call this House to order and call on the registrar to read the minutes of the last public business meeting.
Now, guys, on one side of the House proposing this motion, we have the hopeful, the nostalgic. 65 million deaths in China, 20 million in the Soviet Union, and 2 million in Cambodia. But guys, we can do it right. This revolution is not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy. The struggle will not be short. But just think about how it's worked for our comrades across the globe. Think about how after the revolution, every one of you will get billions and billions of dollars, Zimbabwean dollars. Think about all we can do with that. We can make origami. And you know what the problem is? After all that, there are Trotskyites in here that would condemn us, that would undermine what we did. They will not appreciate our efforts. Just think about the arts block. We gave the most left-wing demographic on campus, the most Soviet-era looking block I've ever seen. And they're still depressed. But are the capitalists really any better? Doom scrolling mindlessly through Sheen and Revolut stock, much like the arts block residents picking their sexuality. It's all buy. Now, more on Diasporic Shut a Huskelt. We have scholar in PPS Shane Burke. Teration, we have comrade of the hist and competitive debater Ziad Anwar. And closing for the proposition, we have Ada Mazur. Now, capitalism and the revenue of military industries has created a global incentive for war to continue perpetually. For example, the genocide on Palestine. On the side of the opposition, representing a defense of imperialist capitalism, we have the debaters from the University of Cambridge in England. There is a joke to be made there, but it would probably take them another 2 years to recognize it. But seriously, we are absolutely delighted to have join us a fantastic caliber of debaters who have come all the way from the UK speaking as our opposition tonight. Ag Uscail Darntation, we have scholar of history, well known for online for his fiery debating style, Sammy MacDonald. Following, we have a scholar now pursuing a master's in public policy, Cecilia Avila Perez. Now, more on Diasporic Shut Ahuna. We have Masters in Philosophy candidate in Politics and International Studies, Ed Parker. Now, is Fader Lynn on Diasporic Shut a hussy? Okay, thank you very much.
Are there no objections to be signed these minutes as a true and accurate record of the last private business meeting? There being none, I shall do it sign. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the University Philosophical Society. Tonight's debate is organized with the help of the Student Economic Review. The motion that stands before the House tonight is: this House would give communism another shot. Standing orders are as follows. Speeches are a maximum of 7 minutes in length. After the first minute and before the last minute of each speech, which will be signified by a bell, speakers from opposing sides and audience members are free to offer points of information. We encourage general audience participation during our debate. If you hear something you like, you can shout, "Here, here." And if you hear something you don't like, you can shout, "Shame." We prioritize respect during our events, and as a result, if anyone has any concerns about what is said tonight, our senior member of the council, Rosa, will be around at the reception all evening. Alternatively, he is contactable by email at smc@google.com, or our President Liam Corcoran is contactable at president@tcdphil.com. Now to introduce our speakers. On the proposition for Trinity University Philosophical Society, we have Shane Burke, Ziad Mazur. the opposition for Cambridge Union, we have Simon MacDonald, Cecilia Avila, and Ed Parker. Without any further ado, I call on the first speaker on the proposition to begin the debate. Here.
Okay, so this is the first time I've spoken in chamber where the debate is actually supposed to be serious, and I can't just make like 6-7 jokes and cabby lame mechanism jokes. I had so many of them in it, but I had to take them all out, so I'm sorry if I overcompensate and this is kind of an incredibly dry and terse speech. So to open the case for the proposition, I will outline Marx's fundamental conceptual distinctions that define the capitalist mode of production. My aim is twofold. First, to demonstrate that this system contains internal contradictions which necessitate its overthrowing. And second, to argue that even if one views these not as contradictions but as manageable tensions, there remains a moral imperative for systemic change. Marx begins his analysis by identifying the minimal conditions for a society to be called capitalist, the generalization of the commodity form. In other words, commodity production must become the dominant mode of production. While pre-capitalist societies engage in exchange, it is under capitalism that this becomes universal for the first time. So the circuit of capital, M1C, M2 as he describes, money is used to purchase commodities, which are then sold for more money, leading to a profit. But how is this profit generated? So how do the commodities purchase different value from those sold? It can't come from the constant capital, machinery and raw materials, because their value is merely transferred to the final product. So simply purchasing the commodity and reselling it unchanged will not, under normal conditions, yield a profit. The only active element in this circuit is the new labour added to transform the initial commodities. Thus, labour is the source of new value. This picture alone seems unproblematic, so if €15 of value are added to a commodity, one might assume that I pay the labourer $13.50 for his labour, with the $1.50 difference representing my kind of innovative contribution qua capitalist. But Marx's crucial contention is that what is purchased is not the labour, but the labour power, the capacity to do work. The value of this labour power is determined by the cost of the commodities needed to reproduce it, food, shelter, and so forth. As long as the value that the worker produces in a day exceeds the value of his labour power, the difference, surplus value, is retained as profit by the capitalist. So the tension is clear, the worker is paid less than the value he creates. This tension is intensified by the capitalist drive to increase profits, which can be achieved in two ways. The first is by increasing absolute surplus value, for instance by lengthening the working day. Historically, this led to violent clashes between the proletariat and bourgeoisie, resulting in reforms like the Factory Acts. The second method, which doesn't lead to as much conflict, is to increase relative surplus value by improving productivity, typically through technological advancement. So the socially necessary abstract labour time, as Marx defines it, needed to produce a commodity is still the same with technological improvement. So initially, each commodity is socially valued as if it had been produced by the same labour time as is generalised. Thus, firms that innovate can earn short-term supernormal profits. When the technological advancement becomes generalised, the labour time required to produce the commodity is reduced and the value decreases, equally decreasing the value of the worker's means of subsistence, effectively lowering the value of labour power and allowing wages to fall. This can only increase relative surplus value if the realised profit is greater than before the advancement in technology. And this can only take place if the bundle of commodities making up the value of labour power is low and the surplus value realised in the sale of commodities is high. However, the process of changing what Marx calls the organic composition of capital, so the ratio of constant capital to variable capital, tends to decrease the rate of profit, since only living labour, new labour, creates new value. And this generates a general tendency for the, I don't really have time. Firms are incentivized to improve productivity, for they will receive short-term supernormal profits. In the long term, the value of the commodities decreases and the wage bill must decrease to maintain profits, but this decrease must be accompanied by an increase in the realized value of commodities in sale. But as wages are suppressed to increase relative surplus value, a crisis of realization emerges. The working class lacks the means to purchase the very commodities that they produce. This is the kind of overproduction crisis in Marxism, or in capitalism, I suppose. The welfare state is a temporary resolution to this problem, and as would any sort of universal basic income be. The welfare state enables workers in the West to purchase some of the oversupplied commodities they have produced, all well and good. But these concessions in the global North are predicated on the intensified exploitation of workers in the global South. Commodities produced by super-exploited labour in the global South are consumed by workers in the global North, temporarily resolving the overproduction crisis while pacifying the northern proletariat with a reasonable standard of living. Similarly, workers in the global south act as the reserve army of unemployed to justify wage decreases in the global north or increases in absolute surplus value, lengthening the working day. So another way for the overproduction crisis to be resolved is through the spatial fix, as outlined in Harvey's The Right to the City. Capital temporarily solves overaccumulation, by fixing overaccumulated supply in physical space. For instance, building new suburbs, skyscrapers, shopping centres, and so on. This is effectively what took place in FDR's New Deal or in Napoleon's infrastructure investment in Paris and across Europe, building railroads and so on. However, in the case of Napoleon, this infrastructure investment was predicated on fictitious capital and the speculative financial system which crashed in 1868. The same situation occurred in the 1940s until the 60s in the US, where highways and infrastructures were built and debt financed, and suburbanization, which was also debt financed, took place, tethering individuals to their debt financed homes, and coincidentally, debt encumbered homeowners are kind of unlikely to revolt. The basic idea, anyway, is that the overaccumulation crises are temporarily resolved through infrastructure projects that are debt financed, and the creation of new financial institutions holding collateralized debt obligations, the packaging of mortgages for sale to investors globally, which leads to more infrastructure projects, more risky debt finance projects, and financial crises, which seems to happen every few decades. But no, this is never a systemic fault of capitalism. It's always reducible to some contingent state of affairs. In any case, in spite of attempts to temporarily alleviate overaccumulation crises, or increasing relative surplus value, or expanding into new territories to proletarianize new peoples, and dispossess them of their land and skills, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall persists. The capitalist class will eventually run out of new population to proletarianize. At that point, tensions will boil over into irreconcilable contradictions, first in the most exploited nations. The overthrow of the mode of production there will inevitably radicalize the West. The USSR could not have achieved communism in isolation because capitalism was still expanding imperialistically, buying off Western workers with the spoils of exploitation of the global south. The overproduction crisis was temporarily resolved by territorial expansion. When there's no one left to exploit, communism's day will come. I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So what would this overcoming look like? Historical examples broadly aligned with what Marx in the Critique of the Gotha program called the transitional state between capitalism and communism. The USSR established social ownership of the means of production, albeit in the form of state control. Market exchange was replaced by central planning, a tentative step towards from each according to his ability to each according to his contribution or work. And this is a first step towards abolishing commodity production, the value form, and abstract labour. A move towards producing use values to meet human needs directly, rather than exchange values for the market. Even if the USSR had been perfectly democratic, non-repressive state, even if it had been a flawless incarnation of the sort of transitional socialism, it wouldn't have yet been communism proper. But this doesn't mean that we should skip over this period altogether, for it's obvious, in spite of what idiotic anarchists say, that we cannot move from a capitalist to a communist society overnight. This is why the project of the USSR, in a democratized and technologically advanced form, deserves another attempt. It is the essential bridge to a future we must be brave enough to strive for once again. Thank you very much.
I'd like to thank the speaker for a very fine and long speech. And Cologne, the speaker on the opposition, to open the case. Here.
Right, hello. I'm sure this is exactly what you wanted this evening, being lectured on your politics by Brits, especially on capitalism and imperialism. But never fear, the Brits are here. We only ever do good, as is famed, although you can probably tell by my orange hair and surname I am indeed half Irish, so I'm not entirely a stranger to your wonderful country, and thank you so much for such kind hospitality, particularly from Matilda. All I can say is you've treated us about 1,000,000 times better than Oxford, which is all that really matters. I'm going to be making kind of two main points here. One is that I'm going to try and get to the heart of the question, because that's always the fun bit, that I think communism itself is an irretrievably flawed and violent belief system, and which more resembles a religion than a coherent social program. That's a bold claim, but I will get into it. And second, that I think progressives need to move on from what is now a 19th century model unfit for the 21st century world. But I just want to start with some rebuttal, because what we heard was a brilliant, incredibly truncated but sophisticated understanding of the way communist systems work, but what wasn't entirely clear within here is there are bits there drawn from different elements of socialist and Marxist traditions, but communism itself is the kind of total fulfillment of that promise and that pledge. There wasn't much delineation made in that speech between what delineates a social democracy from Marxism, from communism, what delineates democratic centralism from anarchism, for example, or Keynesianism from a more serious attempt to create communistic governments. And I want to start to develop some of that. In general, what distinguishes communistic views from other socialistic views is a very strict cyclical view of history, the idea that the triumph of the proletariat is this inevitable preordained struggle, that history hitherto is a history of class struggle and can be described as such, but also a much more all-encompassing seizure of industry, not just socialising key industries, wanting to socialise the entirety of the industry, and also, I think crucially, in what was not mentioned, revolution or permanent revolution as an ends in itself, revolution as a positive and active state that we should strive towards. And that's where I want to get into my first point, which is that I think communism as a belief system, even if we were to resurrect it in the current day, and I think the term resurrect is slightly problematic, but is a belief system that does foster violence through some of the internal flaws within it. Communism always has, at its end, not necessarily a promise of an increased wage or better living conditions, but a utopia, a world in which class distinction is abolished, in which all human problems, be they war, poverty, misery, all of them fall away. And they fall away so perfectly because only a small number of enemies, the bourgeois, the class enemy, the parasites, if only they could be removed, it would all come right. And this utopia somehow never comes. It's rather like a child who is 23 still waiting for the tooth fairy to appear by his bedside. And it's this foundation of this utopianism, which is not unique to communism, but is unique to a whole set of 20th century and 19th century isms. It's these totalities that suggest that if only there is one magic policy prescription fix, it can automatically come right. In the case of communism, it's the nationalization of key industries. And Marx himself,
Communism really is the abolition of the commodity form. So, socializing the means of production would actually be the transitional stage of going to communism.
Yeah, I'll get onto that, but I think it's telling that basically all communism has got stuck in the dictatorship of the proletariat phase, which does suggest that potentially the idea that it's going to give way to a commoditized society should be received potentially as a fantasy. But I'll get onto that. And for Marx, he enthusiastically embraces bloodshed in the pursuit of this aim. Communism itself comes out of the failures and compromises of 1848 liberals. And he wrote furiously on the failures of 1848 that he wrote that force is the midwife of every old society pregnant with a new one. It in itself is an economic power. And he believed that the bourgeoisie were inevitably going to fall, almost if it was certain. This combination of the glorification of violence, the total dehumanization, the reduction of all social forces to overly simplistic areas of class produces what is not really a belief system that is rooted in economics, but one that becomes almost religious in its teleology. The total victory is always final. The gospel, which is Marx, can never be doubted. And anyone who does doubt is a wrecker or someone who's been sent, a kulak, for example. It is therefore, and I'm not saying this purely to say communism must always be violent, but an ideology that suggests, in the words of Marx, that it must have bloody birth throes until a new society can be shortened, simplified, and concentrated, will often find excuses to embrace tyranny within its systems. So you see in basically all systems where you have revolutionary upheaval, a period of very extreme violence being meted out to people who are deemed as class enemies, but more often than not suffer in the forms of innocent children or indeed ethnic minorities. This puts a lie to the pretense that imperialism itself can only be a consequence of capitalism. Of course, imperialism, as we all know, can definitely come as a result of capitalistic exploitation. But it should not be forgotten that in the birthing of new communistic states, messianic crusades to conquer countries, to liberate them, for example, Ukraine back in 1920 at the hands of the Soviet Union, and the aggressive deportation of various minorities, can still happen under this framework. So what I would say is the excesses of communism, the democratic centralism, the vanguardism, they are not aberrations, they are logical consequences of a violent ideology that promises all the answers. And this gets me on to my second point. Now, 100 years ago, just after Irish independence, we could be sitting here, we could be having the exact same debate. That, to me, is a profound failure of the way left-wingers have thought about our society. In that time, we've moved from a society which mainly concentrated production, our relationship to factory work, for example, to one that is now highly concentrated around services. Around 85% now work in services. Global poverty in that time has fallen massively. For example, those living on $1 a day in 1850 was around 70% of the population. It's now less than 10%. In a world where we have moved from industry to services, I've never seen communists come up with a coherent answer as to how the similar frameworks of bourgeoisie, proletariat, all of which were built around industrial productions and the squalor and misery that it produced, can be accurate. And again, I think it comes back to this almost pseudo-religious claims of communists, that it's only the enemies of doctrinal purity that are holding them back. And I think there's a quote from Thomas Paine that sums this up well, hardly a sort of bleeding heart conservative, as any of you will know, but he talked of the vanity and presumption of governing beyond the grave is the most ridiculous and insolence of all tyrannies. And I think quite. We live in a world which is racked by many new challenges, from artificial intelligence to a completely new form of production, an interconnected world in which even small fluctuations in global trade can plunge, as we've seen recently in the United States and others, can plunge millions into deep poverty. This is not something that we can just easily implement 19th century theories on. So I would suggest humbly to this House that it's finally time to turn the book on communistic dogma and for left-wingers to embrace new forms of progressivism, taking into account a new global reality. Thank you.
Speech and call on the second speaker on the proposition to continue the case. Here.
It is often easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. I think what the problem with first opposition is I don't think they engage what we tell you is likely to look like initially. So it is about initially forming something like China or the USSR and eventually hoping the state withers away. I don't think we have to defend whether or not that is likely to happen. I think we have to defend whether or not we ought to aspire towards that and take the initial steps. I'm going to do a few things in this speech. The first is I'm going to respond to some of the stuff that first opposition says. Then I'm going to talk about why we have the capacity to do this, which engages very well with the stuff about like a modernized version of communism, because now due to technology we can do like fully automated luxury gay space communism. And then I'm going to talk about why inequality is in and of itself the worst thing that we ought to try to remedy. Firstly, they tell you that the problem with communism is that it seeks to be like a be-all solution, and then like after you do communism, everything will be perfect. I would posit firstly that this is also true of other ideologies that we probably agree with. So for example, when people wanted to abolish the monarchy or wanted to push away the imperialists, they often framed it as being the end goal, and this is often something an incredibly important thing to do. But then once you achieve those conditions, you're able to say, hey, maybe we can advance in a different, specific way. But the second thing I will point out is they talk about violence, and there's two issues with this. The first is that it's unclear to me that this has to be intrinsic in communism, but the second is that obviously this happens in capitalism all the time as well. A lot of times capitalism was also established through violence or attempted to be forced onto others through violence. See, for example, Vietnam. They tell you that poverty has dropped massively and that because we have service economies, Marxist theories don't apply anymore. The first thing is actually just unclear to me why it is the case that you necessarily have to have industry in these specific ways in order for Marxist theories to apply. I think you can still have labor theory of value when you have like Starbucks workers or people working in different industries. It's unclear to me why it is the case that it has to be exclusive to that. But secondly, on the poverty dropping, the vast majority of the poverty that's dropped historically has been in China, which is probably somewhat more closer to us in terms of being a centralized command economy and being communism with Chinese characteristics than it is towards being total free market capitalism that probably happens in the status quo in most of the time. Finally, I think this debate ought to be about what is intrinsic towards communism and capitalism rather than what is often associated with these things. So even if it is the case that oftentimes both capitalism and communism might engage in violence or might engage in suppression of speech, I think it is the case that we ought to talk about what is unique about these things and what is actually like intrinsic towards them. Firstly then, on capacity. I will point out that oftentimes the criticism of communism is that free market practices allow allocation of resources in the most efficient way. That is to say, because you have the price mechanism and the free market, you're able to send money where it needs to be done, and you have people with finance who are able to back this, etc., etc. I think this is maybe true historically in the past where opposition liked to frame their arguments. But now, due to a massive improvement in technology, both in terms of hardware and software, even if it's not perfect, we're better able to approximate stuff and predict stuff to a larger extent. And I want to be clear here, right? This isn't saying like, DeepSeek is going to save us, it's going to be like perfect, and it's going to be better than the free market and allocation of resources. I think maybe there's still an extent to which there's a margin to which the free market is somewhat superior to the fact that we have all this technology that is able to improve allocation of resources and make these predictions in this specific way. But there's two things to note. The first is I think the margin is substantially smaller now. And insofar as we are more able to solve inequality, because I think inequality is something that is intrinsic to capitalism because of the stuff Shane tells you and the things I'm going to add on in a second, it means I'm happy to make that trade-off. The second thing that they might say is that, a lot of this technology came about because of capitalism, and therefore it's good to keep capitalism around. And not to theory dump, but Marx does talk about this, right? He talks about the fact that a lot of the time the things that we require from communism come about through the increase and improvement in technological efficiencies that capitalism is likely to bring about. So I think it is important that given that we have an improvement in technology to such a large extent, we can probably approximate things to a much more efficient extent than we could in the past. So if you want to talk about putting this debate into a current contemporary context, I think that is what a current contemporary context would look like. Yes, go on.
I'm interested in this global poverty point. It's obviously true that inequality remains a big issue, but on any objective measure, including, if you include all of China, global poverty has massively dropped.
Yeah, okay, so...
It's incorrect that it would inexorably increase.
So I agree that global poverty has dropped. The first thing is the thing I said about how China makes up a majority of this. But the second thing is I would posit that it would drop faster if we implemented communism to a larger extent. So it's not clear to me that that is particularly the most important thing. Let's talk about then inequality and why it's intrinsic to capitalism. Because I will just concede that oftentimes the way communism has been implemented in some instances have resulted in some forms of bad inequality. But these things don't have to be intrinsic towards communism. You can have a version of it where it's implemented to a better extent. The problem is you cannot get rid of inequality within capitalism. And the reason for this is the fact that you have the labor theory of value and have the people who own the capital and the machines and the MRI machines and the Starbucks, land that the Starbucks is on, etc., who are then able to disproportionately extract money from these things. But it gets worse as technology continues to improve, because as is the case that technology improves, the amount of input that technology has in the product that's being made massively increases. And so whoever owns these factories and this advanced technology that has this disproportionate influence on the products that are produced is able to extract the most amount of money. And the thing what they do with that money is they invest in more capital that generates more wealth for them, which is why inequality has skyrocketed to a massive extent. This trivially just doesn't have to happen in communism, and so as a result we're better able to solve inequality on our side of the house. Why then is inequality so incredibly pernicious? The first issue is that it perverts politics to a massive extent. And this engages with the stuff they talk about in terms of implementing social democracies or half measures, right? Because the wealthy are able to do things like lobby politicians or increase advertisement for specific instances to make sure that the people who they want to get elected are more likely to get elected. But secondly, you're more likely to have these path dependencies form. So for example, Ireland is unable to increase corporate tax to a meaningful extent because if they did, they are dependent on these corporations, and these corporations are likely to leave. When European countries try to implement a wealth tax, they have to repeal them in a lot of instances because the rich people, who people are far more dependent on, are telling them to basically fuck off, and then as a result, they have to cave to the things that these wealthy people want. And so as a result, you're unable to actually actualize what it is people on the ground want. So even if they want to stand behind a welfare state that meets all these people, they often aren't able to access that because of the fact that the inequality perverts democracy in the first place. But the second thing it does is it just makes people feel incredibly incontent with life. Because even if their quality of life has improved to an extent, they see people who are substantially better off than that. They see people who are living in bigger houses, driving better cars, living substantially better lives. And this is incredibly problematic because it means that people get dissatisfied with the neoliberal establishment and they turn to two things. The first is they might turn to the communist ideas that we try to push on our side of the house. But the substantially worst thing that they often turn to is the Donald Trumps of the world, is the Reform UKs of the world. That is what ends up happening on their side of the house at the point where you let inequality run rampant. And the problem is that these people also implement incredibly harmful policies. If you think that communism is bad because inefficient allocation of resources and then China debt bubble, this obviously also happens when you have right-wing demagogues in power who don't know how to govern. I think on our side of the house, we are more able to solve one of the most pressing issues in the world. We are able to massively reduce inequality, which I think is the most important thing. For all these reasons, vote proposition.
I would like to thank the speaker for a very fine speech and call on the second speaker on the opposition to continue the case here.
Thank you for your invitation and for having us here. It's an honor. I came here as a Latin American for telling you what you are proposing is a fantasy, very easy to defend when you haven't seen its consequences. I will tell you how it is in the real actual context. Communism offers equity dignity, and social justice. Values every decent person longs for yet, wherever it has been tried. But yet it has delivered poverty, repression, and silence. We, on the opposition, are not here to defend inequality or capitalism excesses. We are here to say that communism has already had its chance and it's failed. Not because of bad politicians, but because of its structure, its logic, and its very design make failure inevitable. The problem is not who implemented it. The problem is the system itself. The first flaw is economic. Communism abolishes private property and replaces the market with central planning. But when everything belongs to everyone, no one feels responsible for anything. We know that. In East Germany, the state controlled every factory, every wage, every price. The result was not equality, but a gray economy of shortage and suspicion. A society so desperate to escape that it built a wall to keep its people in. And I must say, a system that must build a wall to keep its citizens from leaving has already admitted its failure. In Cuba, decades of collectivized production have produced brilliant doctors who cannot afford milk or medicines, and they are doctors. In Venezuela, 21st century socialism turned the richest oil nation in Latin America into one where citizens queue for bread, and the country of most refugees with the most refugee crisis. That's really bad. The other contradiction is human. Communism does not just restrict economic freedom. It suffocates freedom of the individual. Freedom of expression, of movement, of thought, of art and belief. Freedom of expression because dissent threatens the collective truth. We've seen that in Nicaragua, where the revolution that once promised liberation now jails priests and exiles students. Freedom of movement because those who live expose the system failure. Freedom of thought because independent minds cannot be centrally planned. Freedom of art and belief because individuality is dangerous to ideology. In the Soviet Union, the Politburo decided what was true. In East Germany, the Stasi listened to every phone call. In Cuba, dissent is not a right, but a risk. Communism claims to free people from exploitation, and yet it enslaves them to conformity. It begins with we are all equal, and ends with some of us are more equal than others. Members of the House, later. Communism does not fail because people are greedy. It fails because people are human, creative, diverse, imperfect, and free. It tries to abolish inequality by abolishing freedom, and ends up erasing both. We don't need to give communism another shot. We need to give freedom, fairness, and human dignity a better one. Because the problem was never the politicians. The problem is the system, and it failed exactly as designed. Yes, go ahead.
I cannot stand up in public in the UK and say I support Palestine action. So however are you on side of free speech?
That is not related with the topic of the concern. We're talking about a governmental system, not about external political decisions towards that. So, thank you.
I would like to thank the speaker for the very fine speech and call on the last speaker on the proposition to close the case. Here.
As you might hear, similarly to the previous speaker, I'm not from here. And growing up in Eastern Europe, or Central for you Western folks, one develops quite disturbed relation with communism. Through your childhood, you hear the stories similar to this portrayed by the opposition side, but from your parents, grandparents, and history teachers. Core memory of your mother is standing in queues longer than the ones in front of the GMB. Special shout out to people looking for this through the window, like you're insane. And your father talks about imported oranges during Christmas like the greatest luxury, like the cigarettes I'm bringing here from Poland and give them away to my friends, since I don't only believe in normal communism, but first and foremost in the nicotine one. But then you grow up and something starts not really making sense. I mean, a lot of things don't really make sense when you grow up. A lot of things will never make sense again, or they will at some point, I don't know, I hope. Anyways, real, actual context is more complex. You start realizing that the old good times your grandparents talk about with nostalgia is the same communism they were fighting. That times where the world was better, life slower, and everyone was a little less stressed is also communism. That they cannot understand your anxiety regarding housing crisis because they got their flats from the state. That they cannot understand why you are 18 and then 20 and then even as old as Z at 24, and you still can't find a job because in their times everyone had one. And yeah, sure, tell me that these jobs were unproductive, that the economy was inefficient, that half of this was made up. But then tell me that financial advisors, stock traders, and media analysts are efficient jobs. Because in communism, the fake jobs at least produce some material outcome for the other person, and not numbers on the screens and in GDP metrics. And if it's the line that you want to take, then I'll tell you this. It's profoundly sad that capitalism has brainwashed us so deeply that we treat productivity as a value even comparable to preventing poverty or guaranteeing basic needs. And this realization is the moment when you realize that we have an obligation to give communism another shot, because it haven't really lost the first one. And before I will explain, since I don't really want to be cancelled by Trinity News, I don't defend Stalinism. Stalin was a bad guy, okay? Even I don't believe I could fix him, and I have usually quite delusional on this field. But Stalinism was bad because it was totalitarianism, not because it was communism. Because it starved Ukrainians, not because it gave every family a free apartment. Because of Katyn massacre, not because everyone had a job. Because of deportations, not the universal state education. And even with this disclaimer, you'll probably tell me that communism kills people, to which I respond, so is capitalism. But the history is written by the winners, who not only wins the power to rule, but it gets power to shape minds, creates narratives, and constructs the truths. We're all the products of the post-Cold War world in which prevented the expansion of dangerous Marxist ideology. In reality, the dangerous ideology is everywhere. The moment you see it in this posh chamber, which looks even posher since we bring back the portraits, a questionable decision, or the moment you travel here with the cheapest Ryanair from your even posher chamber, there are kids in Congo mining cobalt with their bare hands so that you can have your smartphone to time your quirky speech when you are pretending for 7 minutes that their lives matter, but you'll forget about them an hour later, and you are not changing anything in this life. But if this is too hard for Imagine, look closer. I have a challenge for you. After this debate, after the wine reception, and after you'll share your brilliant intellectual thoughts with others, go to the O'Connell Street. It's 10 minutes away from here, 5 if you walk normal pace, not the Google Maps one, and look in the eyes of tens of people freezing in tents because the 6th richest city in Europe has no shelter for them. And when they ask you for the spare change, tell them that the capitalism works and that the poverty rates have decreased if you wish. Capitalism is killing people right now, each and every day. It's just not you, or at least it's not you yet. But if you want to say that communism doesn't really work, take 3 steps back. Firstly, look around, touch the grass, reread your notes from the Ziyad speech. I know he's barely intelligible, but I swear there was some smart stuff there. And even if you don't believe him, just check your biases. Do you really think that communism can't work, or you were educated in Western systems soaked with American influence? Do you really think that capitalism works, or you just keep your eyes closed for people outside of your university bubble? Do you really care about whether it works or not, or maybe you enjoyed your privileged position and don't want to abandon it? And to be clear, I'm not sure if it's going to work. Maybe it doesn't, but what we have right now clearly doesn't work as well. And when the situation is so without a way to resolve it from within the conditions, then out of the pure urge to survival, we have to intend a new space. And yes, maybe it is a utopia, but utopia is a matter of the urgency right now. We are forced to imagine this because this is the only way, and this is what we need to do today. And the lack of clarity that the opposition side is telling us is not a flaw, it's an advantage. Communism stands from the commune. That means that we need to create a new solution together that is able to solve these problems. And yeah, it will probably not help me in the SCR debate, but financial capital is made up. It's just astrology for the white man, and I don't really care about what the numbers of their charts say. I've joined the Phil for the funky philosophical stuff, so here are two thoughts with which I want to leave you. First, capitalism is designed to make you unhappy. It grows from you wanting to buy more and more, and artificially create needs you don't have. You don't actually need a Labubu, nor matcha latte, or AirPods, or 7 steps Korean skincare routine. But if you feel like you do, you will buy more, and you'll work more so you can buy more, and you'll chase satisfaction that you'll never have, but you'll constantly feel like one day you could. And it will make you keep going, but going from nowhere, like this stupid hamster in this willy thing, you know, that's how you look like. I think we would be much happier if we weren't told that the threshold for happiness is so high. Communism doesn't do the same for you. That's why my grandparents say that life used to be simpler. Second, capitalism is designed for the majority to lose. There's no value in you being rich if there's no poor. Trickle down is a myth. If you are born rich, you'll stay rich. If you're born poor, maybe there's 10% chance for you to escape. And then congrats, good for you. But the only thing you become is the advert for capitalism to show you and praise you that you've worked hard enough and succeeded so everyone could do the same. Because not everyone can. There is no enough space at the top to everyone to get there, and the majority needs to be poor so you don't have to be anymore. But if the price for my matcha is everyone else starving, I can live off the cheapest bitter black coffee that my grandparents used to drink, because the aftertaste of moral disgust stays in your mouth much longer. And yes, communism might not be perfect. You can't drink Labubu Dubai chocolate oat matcha latte, and architecture is quite depressive, so it's arts block. But are capitalism skyscrapers actually that much better? I have started with Polish accent, and with Polish accent I want to end. In the famous novel Przedwiośnie, Żeromski defined glass houses as a metaphor for the utopian world, mending people's mind but impossible to achieve. And I think it's quite ironic that capitalism decided to build so many of them just to make people homeless outside their shiny walls. Or maybe that's precisely making sense. Thanks.
On the opposition to close the case and the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
I've made the zany decision here to write my notes on paper, so they're all over the place. But thank you very much for having us, ladies, gentlemen, members, comrades, and friends. It is fantastic to be here in Trinity and to be at the Philosophical Society, not least debating in such exceptional company. I would like, if I may, to start my remarks by just clarifying the terms of the motion and the points of clash as we see them and as we interpret them. We've heard three exceptional speeches from the proposition, and actually speeches that we as the opposition, haven't found a huge amount to disagree with. I thought Adriana's speech was exceptional about the structural problems in modern capitalism. But we, ladies and gentlemen, as the opposition, are not the advocates for the status quo inherently. We do not need to defend every element of liberal capitalism, even the fundamental values of liberal modern capitalism, to oppose communism. There has been a false dichotomy that has ran consistently through this debate, that if you want meaningful structural change, if you're not happy with the world as it is, then you need to be a communist. What the opposition haven't argued, or proposition, you know who I mean, what TCD haven't argued consistently is why they think communism is specifically the answer. They've made very strong critiques of capitalism, but they have not provided an argument for why. One moment, please, I need to get some progress. And while Sami has made very articulate critiques of its political dangers, of the likelihood and the necessity of adopting violence to make its initial progress, There has been no, in my opinion, countervailing argument for why communism specifically can only provide the solutions. I believe that we need meaningful structural change in this country. I'm fully prepared to admit that we live in an unfair hierarchical system, but it is not the case that communism is the way forward, and I think actually communism does away with the fundamental protection of rights that I think is really important. And the fundamental thing that communism gets rid of, that I think we should recover from modern liberal democracy, that we should recover from the modern Enlightenment, is the idea that the individual is the central unit of politics who has rights that are generated within themselves, that should advocate for their own rights against the state, not as part of a communist collective, but against the state. I think that underpins Sami's argument against government overreach. I think it underpins Cece's argument about economic incentives. We need an individual who argues for their own rights, and we need radical progressive change, but radical progressive change that keeps in mind that fundamental point. Right, that whilst we progress, whilst we change society, whilst we restructure it, this thing that we have constructed together, this liberal idea that the individual should be the harbinger of their own rights, should defend their own rights against the state, is fundamental. So I need to show then that this idea is inherently incompatible with communism, which to do as quickly as possible, it's probably most expeditious. Sorry, I've got through nowhere near enough of my speech. It would be expeditious, I suppose, then, to quote Marx himself. He makes a very clear dichotomy between individual rights and what he sees as communal rights in a communist state. Well, he doesn't use the language of rights particularly consistently, but the idea of communal material rights is picked up later by 20th century communists, particularly in East Germany and Eastern Europe. He says in The Jewish Question in 1843 that individual rights are the right to the egoistic man, who is inherently therefore separated from his community. This leads in the Communist Manifesto 5 years later to social atomism, leaving only the icy water of egotistical calculation and no other social nexus between people other than naked self-interest, which are all fantastic terms, but he inherently separates those from rights. But as we look to the history of progressive movements in Eastern Europe, particularly in response to communism, we see a very different story. I'm going to go one worse than Sami earlier as a Brit lecturing the Irish on colonialism, and I'm going to attempt as a Brit to lecture the Polish on Polish history, because I think Adam Michnik is a fantastic example, and movements like his, like Solidarność, the Workers' Defence Committee, like Václav Havel's Charter 77, that bring together socialist elements. They bring together working class elements in society. They originate out of trade unions, but they do so in opposition to communism and in opposition to what flattens the individual. They use the notion of individual rights in the complete opposite way as to how Marx thinks it will be used. They use it to unite movements from across the country, and they use it to fight for their freedom in the face of communist imperialism, which I think has been falsely ascribed as a monopoly of capitalist systems. This idea of social atomism, ladies and gentlemen, is not what comes out of individual rights. What we can salvage from individual rights is a meaningful, progressive, transformative structural change that brings people together on that basis. I think the arguments that are strongest against communism are those of the dangers that it brings, but not that those dangers are necessarily inherent in a certain typological way. We're not going to see, as you argued very well, Ziad, an exact repeat of the same processes by which communism was incredibly harmful in the 20th century. We live in a very different society, and historians and political theorists who try and make exact predictions are generally not very good at it. But what we do know, having looked at Marx's treatment of rights, is that if we adopt communism, specifically communism, not just social progressive change, but specifically communism, we have to do away with this idea of individual rights. And we cast off what I think is the strongest protection of liberty, of material well-being, and your protection from the state. It is very easy, ladies, gentlemen, comrades and friends, to stand in a chamber such as this, where the whole point is freedom of speech, where the whole point that's taken for granted is your academic freedoms. And just to respond to Ziad's very articulate point of information earlier, we are advocating for freedom of speech. I am not advocating for the British government. I would empower you as many times as you can to say that you stand by Palestine action, but that doesn't go against the government. It is very easy to stand in a place like this and say that we can weigh certain progressive angles, weigh giving communism another shot, because we assume that the rights that we have accrued throughout the development of the liberal Enlightenment are to be taken for granted. It's very easy to do that in a democracy and in a debating union as illustrious as this one. But I would remind you, and I will leave you with this members, that as you go forth, as the opposition strongly advocate for you to do, as you go forth to try and bring about radical structural change that topples the patriarchy, that deals with the colonial hierarchies inherent in British politics, that makes the British economy work for people, or the Irish economy in your case, obviously, and tries to make transformative change, remember that you do so, you need to make sure that you keep hold of these fundamental safeguards that the liberal Enlightenment has given to you. And that is the idea that you as an individual have rights that are sovereign to you, that exist in you, and that you, against the state, as opposed to state tyranny, as opposed to state overreach, as opposed to the communist dictatorship of the proletariat, have it in your power to protect. Please make radical structural political change, but do so without jettisoning this most valuable of inheritances from the Enlightenment. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
General thanks to all speakers for their comments and a wonderful debate. The judges will now retire to determine the outcome of the debate, and I will now offer some general comments. What a wonderful atmosphere and a very hot discussion and hot in every dimension, you know. I mean, thank you, dear friends, for the invitation. It has been a great experience to be with you and listen to this fascinating debate. Really fascinating. Universities should remain a place of free debate, sometimes even a battlefield of ideas. But the main question is not who will win, but to what extent a debate brings us closer to catching the truth. We should bear in mind this noble notion that debate is not a debate for its own sake, but for searching for truth. Sometimes it's difficult to convince each other, and sometimes no common ground is found, but dialogue remains and constitutes a significant value. Why? Because dialogue requires openness to the other person. Both sides should approach it with the attitude of intellectual honesty and assume that the other is also committed to seeking the truth for the common good. Every time has its own unique challenges, unique flavor. I think this type of discussion about communism would have been improbable when I was a student during the communist rule in Poland in the 80s of the last century. And the reason would not only be a lack of academic freedom, and I would like to underline this, lack of academic freedom, but first of all, the fact that all of us at that time in Poland, I think, including also communists, stopped believing in these ideas. This type of idea to preserve or restore communism would sound like something from a different planet. After massive protests in the summer of the 1980, when the Solidarity movement was launched, and thank you so much for mentioning Solidarity, after the election of Polish Cardinal Karol Wojtyła as Pope 2 years earlier, and his powerful message of freedom and democracy during his first visit to Poland in 1979, there was a strong impression in the society that communism, at least on the level of ideas, was over. The only thing that was still to be done to restore free, independent Poland was to topple the communist regime. The regime which just wanted to keep power, or at least to keep influence, but not necessarily to promote communism. It was already ideological, empty. Let me offer a few words about the experience of communism in Poland and throughout Eastern and Central Europe. You mentioned a little bit from a different perspective, I think. Communism in Poland had never been regarded as a system of our own choice. It was always regarded as a foreign system imposed on us after the Second World War by the Soviet Union. It was ruthless. Our experience was tragic. First, Communist Russia wanted to export its revolutionary ideas just after the October Revolution. At that time, in the 1920s, we defended our homeland. But they came again in 1939 when, as allies of Nazi Germany, they attacked Poland. And finally, they arrived in 1945 and this time stayed for half a century. What was it? How did communism work in practice? In practice, you do not, I think, recall those days. Freedom of speech, expression, gathering, and religion had been suppressed. Those brave who could not agree with the advent of the new order were put in jail or persecuted in other ways. People were murdered for political reasons, not to mention the Soviet Union, where millions perished in concentration camps. In Poland, the situation was far better, but still bad. Peasants were given a small amount of land, but larger private arms were prohibited. Private business was almost impossible. Freedom of movement was drastically restricted. It wasn't easy to get a passport and go abroad. People were deprived of liberty, and to pursue a career, they had to become members of a communist party. Otherwise, they were marginalized. One can argue that if this tragic lesson is learned, it is possible to return to the communist idea purified of all historical errors. I do, however, have serious doubts. In my opinion, the original communist idea deprives a person of freedom and underlines the superiority of society over the individual. While we should look for a reasonable balance here, imposes a one-size-fits-all approach, ignoring many dimensions of human beings and, first of all, depriving people of their spiritual needs. It has deeply rooted authoritarian tendencies. I think it is fitting at this moment to recall Leszek Kołakowski, the renowned Polish philosopher, who flirted with communism in his youth, but then came to realize the inherent flaws of the communist philosophy, was forced into exile and spent the majority of his adult life working at Oxford as well as American universities. If you have a chance, take a look at his writings. To clarify my point, and I think this is important for all of you, out of respect to all your arguments, and I just try to listen very carefully. However, from that point, it's not so easy. To clarify my point, I would like to make a clear distinction. The one thing is communism, which assumes the dictatorship of ideology over reality and the achievement of goals with revolutionary means. The other is to pursue social justice with respecting democracy and freedom, embracing the peaceful coexistence of people with different approaches to life, diverse convictions, and various faiths. And what is absolutely crucial is respecting people's choice, as expressed in free and democratic elections. The trouble with communism is, this is a historical experience of half of Europe, that once they impose their power on society, they think they are entitled to hold it forever. There is nothing wrong with seeking better solutions to meet people's needs. It is right and just for you to pursue this goal. It is absolutely normal that when looking for better ways, you are inspired by the past. I wish you further exploration of ways to shape a better future for your generations and generations of your children and grandchildren. When looking for this, please also consider the experiences of your parents and grandparents. To leap forward in a better future, not to fall into the abyss of past mistakes. It was an absolute joy to be with you. I really would like to thank you once again for the invitation, and I wish you just a really better life than the previous generations. Thank you so much. And according to the script I was given, right now I have to read this. I call this meeting adjourned.